I'm coming from Georgetown, Ontario, and that means I'm a part of the Credit River watershed. I would say that that is my home river, and I know it very well. However, I grew up in Kitchener, so my sister river is the Grand, and I care deeply about it as well. So I'm interested in all watersheds across Canada. When I was national biologist for TU, I spent a lot of time across Canada, and I was just astounded by the breadth and quality of our landscape, and especially the stewardship of a lot of Indigenous folks, especially those that I worked with in BC, the Tunaha First Nation on the Elk watershed. So without further ado, I will see if my slide deck will start to work. And see here, it usually seems to take a few seconds for it to click in.
It's up on our screens, Jack.
It's up, and I'm just trying to get it to move forward. That's something. A sec here. There we are. So why watershed planning? And the answer, of course, is in a humorous way, is if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And our challenge right now is that we don't have an overall plan on how our systems function. So we're at what I call ad hoc management, and that is a problem. And we used to have our path. We sort of walked away from it back in the early 2000s, so we need to refine it again. As well, I was trying to see if I can get rid of that. Has everybody got that top screen there as well, or is it just me? Okay.
It's just you, Jack.
Okay, that's fine. I don't mind that for myself. Anyway, so this is just an overview. I'll talk a little bit about why we manage on a watershed basis. You'll hear me talk about context quite a bit, because if you, as I said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. In other words, you lack context of what your goal and your direction is. I'll talk briefly about some of the key elements of sound watershed planning, and a little bit about why natural infrastructure and watersheds are so important for sustaining people and the environment. Those that know me know I like to show this slide because it tells us that we did know better. This is from 1946. The Carling Conservation Digest shows a young lad going fishing in 1872, coming back with a stringer of trout. The stream is tight and narrow and clear. Lots of little critters and dicky birds. The forest comes close to it. A very healthy environment. And there, in 1947, is the young lad. Now he's a grandfather. He's talking to his grandson, saying, "When I was your age, William, a sparkling stream flowed here. What you see has resulted from the destruction of the forests and the swamps." In other words, cause-effect relationships. We did understand. So, challenges that without context and how we manage and our consequences of our actions will continue to what I consider to be internalized benefits and externalized costs. We need to do better again. So part of the problems that we have is that quite often, most of our issues that we have are becoming more and more complex, especially with climate change. Most government legislation and policies are single issue focused. You have an issue, you create a policy for it. As over time, you have many policies. And in many cases, in any particular watershed, half those policies may be in conflict with each other, given the nature of the watershed and how it functions. As well, as I mentioned, new emerging issues are rising with climate change and our requirement to try to adapt to climate change by rebuilding the resilience of our watersheds, or, if you will, our natural infrastructure. Without a plan that understands how the system functions, how can you put good adaptation methodologies forward? And finally, coordinating these specific landscapes through an ad hoc management leads to long-term degradation to built infrastructure and degraded environments. And it's not as though we don't know better. This was recognized as far back as the 1930s with the creation of the Conservation Authorities Act, or the early proceedings of the Conservation Authorities Act, realizing we needed to manage on a watershed basis. So here's my little game of playing poetic. So I say the issues spark like flames off a Catherine wheel. Most people know what a Catherine wheel is. At fireworks displays, that's that wheel that they light and it spins faster and faster, throwing sparks everywhere. And I equate that to the fact that sparks are the issues that we try to develop policies for. The challenge is that unless we deal with the cause of those sparks, more issues and sparks will arise. We have to realize that the wheel, or in our case, the watershed, is the context, not the sparks. We need to address the wheel. Sadly, we tend to forget that or ignore it. So what do we need? So we need that type of contextual planning and understanding in order to understand the form and function of our particular watersheds. By understanding their form and function, in other words, how the different pieces on that landscape function together to create the things we see on the landscape and in the landscape. Without that understanding, we cannot understand cause-effect relationships of different land use and land activities on the rest of the system. As well, without understanding the form and function of your system, it limits the number of options or consequences of various management outcomes. We don't understand them, which means that it leads to a trajectory of degradation over time. And finally, without a full understanding of the watershed and how it functions, how can you create the full breadth of what is possible to do to improve it through various management options? And the biggest challenge there is that somebody once told me that that I have to ask the community what they want when we were doing some planning. And I said, how can I ask them what they want until I can tell them what they could have? And then when they fully understand the full breadth of what they can have, then they can make choices. The challenge is we don't do that. And ultimately, what we need is we need agencies coordinating on a watershed basis. Political boundaries and individual political boundaries do not necessarily encompass watersheds. And that means that there's conflict between different jurisdictions. Unless you have a watershed-based agency coordinating these issues, things don't get solved. I just wanted to stress to you that watershed and the political process or planning process are only two of the different types of ways one can address issues on the landscape. It all depends on what the question is. In our case, if the question is, how do we manage land and water within a certain system in order to understand how it works and to better society, then we tend to focus on watersheds, or in the case of lake areas, lake basins. But these are the two things that we have to work together. There's, as I said, there's other ways of divvying up the pie, but these are two that work well when it comes to the changes, how we manage land and its consequence on water. Also, we have to understand that that type of environmental planning is also political and economic as well. So as I said before, governments tend to manage natural systems through policy and programs. Each of those policies or programs is a result of a single issue that they were trying to address. However, these issues are often not connected to other concerns about the landscape and therefore create conflict and create challenges for how we implement them. Therefore, in order to make a difference, really, environmental management must embrace that type of contextual thinking, since natural systems are inherently interconnected. And this will be especially important when we're dealing with trying to look at strategies to adapt to climate change, because unless we know how the system functions, how can we create solutions that better the whole system? So watershed management is, we call it integrated watershed management, because we're integrating a whole variety of things from the ecological, the physical and chemical and biological sciences, economics and social needs and interests. So ultimately, it's a process of managing human activities and with the natural resources in an area that we define as a watershed, depending on what size of watershed you wish to work on. Again, it accounts for that spatial and temporal aspects of the landscape, how it changes over time. And part of good watershed planning is saying, what did this system look like 100 years ago? Or ideally, if you have indigenous folks with you, what was it like 1,000 years ago? How did your forebears manage this landscape? What was it like then? So we can compare how far it slid to the point we're dealing with right now. As well, ideally, watershed plans should be revisited every 10 years as you make decisions, implement them, assess them. Then in a 10-year period, you refine them and improve them. That's why we call it adaptive environmental management approach. What are we trying to do? We're striving ultimately for sustainable use, management of development. By the way, development does not necessarily mean growth. We're looking at restoring, damaged landscapes and making them healthier again, and protecting features that are critically important to the system and how it functions. We also have to recognize with watershed planning and management that things are complex. Now, one great quote that I've heard before is that complex issues often have easy to understand wrong answers. Things are complicated, and unless you have a good grasp of a system's form and function, how can you make sense of the different decisions you might make and what type of outcomes may occur? And finally, we're trying to integrate those scientific components and also identify which agencies at what different levels of government and community where we get the chance to actually implement things so that everybody is working on the same, or should say singing from the same song sheet. And really, we're trying to strive well for social learning and an engaged community. Only a small part of a good watershed plan are the plans that come out of it. The greater part is providing information and awareness to the community and how their system works, so that they can make long-term better decisions as well, not just the short-term current ones that are recommended in the plan. So I say that watershed planning sets the context for sorting out and linking agendas and mandates for all sorts of different planning processes. If you have a good watershed plan, it helps to inform all of the things I have shown you on this screen. If you don't have a good watershed plan, you're dealing with ad hoc management, and you can't be sure of the consequences. And a lot of those consequences are usually bad. Finally, we have to understand as well that that does link into systems. I remember umpteen years ago as a young guy working on watershed planning in the province, that somebody from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Planning came to ours and said, "You guys are in conflict with us because you're trying to usurp the planning process or the Planning Act." We said, "No, we're trying to provide information to the Planning Act." "Oh, no, you're trying to take over the Planning Act." I said, "No." And this slide demonstrates what we're trying to do is provide information at different scales of watershed planning that inform different levels of planning processes here in Ontario. It's not a conflict. It's an informed materials that can provide better decision-making at all levels of government. So, in summary, the answer is pay me now or pay me later. Without a system's context, we're doomed to fail, address those cumulative degradation that is constantly occurring, or effectively adapt to climate change. And we're seeing it in my time. I've watched our watersheds and our streams deteriorate dramatically. Sometimes we have small wins, but in many cases, things ain't the way they used to be, and things are getting worse and more challenging. Watersheds are a key to linking land and water management so we can understand the consequences of our actions and make informed decisions. And I'll identify alternatives to some of the decisions that are tough. As well, as I stressed before, most of our policies only address one issue, and this is a conversation I had years ago when we looked at all the policies under the Planning Act. And I said, if I were to take any particular watershed, half of those policies will be in conflict with each other. It may vary depending upon which watershed, but unless we have a way of sorting out which should take priority based upon the betterment of the watershed and its communities, how the heck can you have a sound planning process? And ultimately, site-specific regulation, which is what we are dealing with right now, primarily slows the slide degradation. It does not prevent or improve. So I just want to say that if we want to move forward, we have to realize that we can't solve today's problems with the same level of thinking that created them. And ad hoc planning, the way we're dealing with it right now, is basically using old ways of thinking to try to solve new problems, and it's not going to work. Thanks very much.